Before you ask, it was not the iron skillet on my head. It's skin cancer surgery I had this past week. We're glad that you are here on this Sunday morning at the 9:50 service. Also, for those who are watching online, this is the one we broadcast. Glad you're joining us as well. President Grover Cleveland signed the bill that became law in 1894 regarding the establishment of Labor Day during his second term in office, which was non-consecutive to his first time. Grover Cleveland, is the only president in U.S. history to serve two non-consecutive terms. And in 1894, the Congress declared that the first Monday of September be a national holiday to honor the nation's workers and their contributions to the well-being of our country. The actual first Labor Day was celebrated 12 years earlier in 1882 in New York City. Oregon was the first state to declare an official holiday in 1887. And you know, Labor Day often marks the end of summer. It's that time between Memorial Day and Labor Day when most families take a vacation or have some extra time off work or hopefully enjoy a little bit slower pace of life. In fact, you have probably thought before, life would be easier if. Life would be easier if I had more money. Life would be easier if I had more time off from work. Life would be easier if I had better health. Life would be easier if I could understand all this technology better. Life would be easier if my rights weren't being trampled. Life would be easier if I had a better job. Life would be easier if my children would help me. We're wrapping up this series, Things Jesus Never Said. And today's is, I will make your life easy. What did Jesus say about that idea? Did he promise his followers an easy life? A college friend of mine who's also in ministry arrived at home 10 days ago to discover his wife deceased in the kitchen floor. Does that sound like an easy life? He posted on social media later that evening, Teresa made me homemade cinnamon rolls this morning for breakfast. Tonight, she is in heaven. That experience doesn't sound easy. One of our members texted me a week ago yesterday saying our daughter was just involved in a car accident. We're on our way to OU to check on her. Fortunately, there were no injuries to either person involved, but 2 days later, the same member texted saying, today on my way to work, guess what? I discovered a nail in my tire. Naturally, the tire can't be repaired. It has to be replaced. Doesn't sound like an easy weekend for that family. Another college friend of mine who's in ministry had chest pains a few days ago. This past Monday had a quintuple heart bypass, and a few hours later had to be rushed back into surgery due to internal bleeding and to have the surgery redone. That doesn't sound easy to me. A man at our church texted me early yesterday morning to inform me that he had just lost his job after 10 and a half years with a vibrant company. You see, easy for some is defined in life as life without any pain or life without any troubles or life that's without any worries. 3 weeks ago, we focused on the statement Jesus made when he said, in this world, you will have trouble. And depending on how you see problems in life, can either make you better or they can make you bitter. But some people, even if all those kinds of difficulties in life would actually be removed, would not find life that easy because they wouldn't have anything to complain about. Well, let's see what Jesus said about life being easy, where it occurred, how it should change our outlook on life, and an objective that he gives to remember, that we need to remember as we're walking with him. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 12, and we're going to see the occurrence in which there is a phrase where Jesus said, take life easy. And it's where he is telling a parable with his disciples, particularly about money and possessions. Now remember, there were either 38 or 39 of parables, depending on the various stories and how you label them, but at least 16 of those 38 parables were about money and possessions. And beginning in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions." And he told him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I will do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. then who'll get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how they'll be. Hello. Just in case you were falling asleep already, okay? This is how it'll be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. So Jesus shared this parable about a man whose primary purpose in life was to accumulate things so he could say to himself, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And the request of this man to have his brother share the inheritance does not sound that unusual. I mean, don't all parents treat their children equally when it comes to inheritance? Probably 15 years ago, I had a graveside service up at Jersey Cemetery of an elderly lady who owned a lot of property in the New Albany area. And it was worth a lot of money. She had hundreds of acres. She had many offers to buy her property, but she kept declining with the reasoning that her 3 adult children could deal with it after she was gone. And as her health began to decline, her daughter, her only daughter, stepped in and provided care for her mother. But she had 2 brothers. The 2 sons did not help with the mother, and as a result, the mother ended up changing her will, leaving all the property to only the daughter. But sometime between the mother's death and the graveside service, the 2 sons discovered the change in her will. I received phone calls from all 3 adult children, each expressing their opinions about the service I was to perform. Each shared how they were affected by the inheritance. Even the daughter who called me because she felt like she deserved all the inheritance and her brothers didn't deserve any of it. And the day of the graveside came, and at the time we were to begin, the only people there were the funeral director, 2 gravediggers, and myself. About a minute after we were to start, the 3 kids came in 3 different vehicles, each driving their own. None of them got out. They rolled down the windows. They listened from inside their vehicles. I offered a very short message, a very brief prayer, and before I said amen, all of them went out flinging gravel because they couldn't get along. When this person in the crowd asked Jesus to tell his brother to divide the inheritance, maybe the older brother had been unfair, or maybe this man didn't like the Levitical law, which said the older brother was to get 2/3 of the inheritance, leaving only 1/3 for the younger brother. I had a friend in high school. His parents had 6 children, and there was quite an age span from the oldest to the youngest, and he was the youngest. And when their parents died, the finances were divided equally among the 5 living children at the time. But my friend Jerry actually inherited the house. They were all in agreement on that because the older 4 remaining had their houses, and they were all paid for, so they were very amicable. But Jesus' response is quite interesting here, and he immediately saw through this man's request directly to his heart. He cuts to the root of the problem. Watch out for greed, because life is not ultimately about the abundance of possessions. The premise for many is the more you have in this world, the easier life is going to be. But we know that there's not an equal distribution of finances. People have different skills and different opportunities and different situations regarding inheritance, different pay scales. This past week, received an email from Bob Russell Ministries offering funds for benevolence. Over the last 15 years, Bob Russell Ministries has distributed over $60,000 to just people in this church here. And we're one church of about 200 that receive this opportunity each time. There is a person that's very generous to his ministry that wants to provide funds for those who need them. When Bob was here in December, I asked him, I said, is that a group of people that do that, several people over the 15, 20 years, or is that one person? He said, that is one business person, and that one business person over a period of less than 2 decades has given $2.3 million just for benevolence. But not everybody can do that. So for those who have an abundance of finances and possessions, admittedly, life can certainly seem easier. You know, it's easier when you walk into the grocery store and you can afford everything. You can't do that today. It's easier if you can walk in and don't have to pinch pennies. It's easier if you can go online and just pay all your utilities without wondering if there's enough money in your account to cover the necessities. When our son was probably 5, I think it was 1994, there was a conference for ministers and their families down in Florida, and we decided we were going to attend, and we were going to stay a few extra days and take our son to Disney World. So I got a Disney credit card, and we charged everything at Disney: the hotel, the food, the admission to the parks, the souvenirs. And it's been too long ago for me to remember how much we charged in 1994, but I think just 39 more payments and it's going to be paid off here real soon. Solomon in the Old Testament pursued wealth for a long time. And he discovered it wasn't the answer to everything. His book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament is a journal of his various pursuits in life. He pursued knowledge, amusements, possessions, education, riches, and any of those pursuits are not wrong in and of themselves. But it's about the futility of trying to live and enjoy life apart from God. And multiple times in Ecclesiastes, Solomon uses the phrase chasing after the wind with each of his pursuits. When he gets down to the end of the book, all of the cynical rambling he does in that book, it makes sense when he says in Ecclesiastes 12:13, now all has been heard, here's the conclusion of the matter, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. The famous American novelist Ernest Hemingway lived a full life. By age 19, he was decorated for heroism in World War I. His first novel, The Sun Also Rises, was published when he was only 27. His lifetime itinerary included places like the United States, Spain, France, China, Cuba. He was noted in World War II for both his writing ability, his courage in battle. He won the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Prize. His writing was very gutsy, the way he often lived. He was known to be a big game hunter, a deep-sea fisherman, a bullfighting enthusiast. He crammed several lifetimes into one, but despite such a full life, the novelist was in fact unfulfilled. He drank heavily. He married 4 different times, and after a long bout with depression, he took his own life in 1961. Oh, the parable that Jesus shared focuses on a man much like Hemingway. He had all kinds of surplus in this life, but he failed to recognize the proper perspective. He said, I'll tear down my barns, I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. He wanted to do that so he could just take life easy or have an easy life. Oh, what is to be the outlook for a Jesus follower? How do we, as Christ followers, have the right perspective about life? Does the Bible give us any clarity? Now, I want to give you 2 outlooks that we need to have. The first one's going to be found in a different passage back in Luke chapter 9, and then the second one, we're going to come back here to the passage in Luke chapter 12. But in Luke 9, beginning at verse 23, then he, that's Jesus, said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self or their very soul? So one of the outlooks we need to have on life to have the right perspective is sometimes there has to be a denial of self. We're not much into self-denial in our culture today. Most prefer entitlements. Instead of giving up something, how do I get something for nothing? It's kind of like the guy who's at the gym in the evenings after work, and he's using one of the elliptical machines by the window, and he watches another guy get out of his car, and that person's rather large, and in his hand is a Blizzard from Dairy Queen. He wanted to get into shape, but he doesn't want to make the personal sacrifices. Jesus says if we want to be followers of his, we have to deny self. And the person in this parable that Jesus told wanted to only accumulate for self and not deny himself anything. And we're living in a time of Christianity when some, even wanting to be followers of the Lord, want to live in both worlds. But by definition, a Christian is a Christ follower, meaning to commit to following him in every area of our lives. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to follow him perfectly, but it does mean our outlook should be, how can I be most obedient to the Lord? Can we forgive a person who's hurt us? Can we save intimate relationships for marriage? Can we be generous with our finances? Can we control our urge to use profanity at work just so we can fit in with others? Several years ago, MSNBC carried a report about a group of new vegetarians. They interviewed one of the new vegetarians, a 28-year-old then named Christy Pugh. One of her quotes captures the viewpoint of the group. She said, I usually eat vegetarian, but I really like sausage. So she represents a growing number of people who eat vegetarian but makes exceptions. They don't eat meat unless they really like it. Now, as you might imagine, the true vegetarians are not happy about these new vegetarians. So the new vegetarians have now renamed themselves, and they are now called flexitarians. Christy Pugh said, I really like vegetarian food, but I'm just not 100% committed. I tell people I'm a vegetarian until meat's put on the plate. Flexitarian is a good way, though, to describe how many people approach their commitment to Christ. They feel good about being identified with Christ, but to deny self is not part of the package for them. I'd prefer to keep my money than to help the poor. I'd prefer to use my Sundays for recreation instead of worship. I'd prefer to fit in with the crowd at times with my profanity, with my drinking. Jesus never said life would be easy. He said it could cost you something to follow him. But here's the good news. Jesus will meet you where you are. John Weiss, in his book, Me Too, Experience the God Who Understands, writes about Jesus healing leprosy. And he notes that Jesus can become more contagious than some of the diseases and the difficulties with which he dealt. He writes, the leper sickness didn't spread to Jesus. Rather, Jesus' life spread to the leper. Jesus isn't approaching you wearing a surgical mask and rubber gloves. He's never worn a hazard suit in his life. Your struggles with pornography, your battle with eating disorders, your foul mouth and corrupt heart don't scare him in the least. If you want to be free, he wants to set you free from whatever has banished you. But to be a Christ follower, you sometimes have to have the outlook, the perspective. There has to be a denial of self. And then we know from the parable in Luke 12, back to it, ultimately there's going to be death. Look again at chapter 12 of Luke, 20 and 21. God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who'll get what you've prepared for yourself? This will be how it is with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Now, I don't think Jesus was calling this wealthy person a fool for being ambitious. I don't think he was calling this wealthy person a fool for having worldly wealth. I think Jesus called him a fool because he thought his riches would keep him from dying. Jimmy Buffett died this past Friday at the age of 76. He's reportedly worth $1 billion. Riches didn't prevent his death. When I was working on my master's degree a few years ago, I had a class in Christian ethics, and the final assignment was to write a paper of about 25 topics from a prepared list. We'd pick one of those topics. Most of the people in the class chose war or abortion. I happened to choose affluence and the Christian. I focused on how in the Bible there are some wealthy people that helped Jesus' ministry. People like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha. All those people, plus some others, seemed to have affluence in the first century, and yet even with their worldly wealth, they were dedicated Christ followers. And I even used as an example in my paper, David Green, the CEO of Hobby Lobby. And during the 2008 recession, he gave all of his employees a 10% raise across the board, and he stated in an interview how he could do that because he himself was worth personally hundreds of millions of dollars. But the professor didn't like my paper. It is 20 pages long, and when he emailed it back with his comments, I printed out it was 35 pages long. He ripped it to shreds. He believed everybody ought to be equally wealthy and that Jesus had no rich friends and that first century Israel was based totally on socialism. It was partially, but not completely. So I sent it back and refuted some of his arguments, but he never responded. You know, I took 12 classes for my master's degree. I got A's in 11 of them. Can you guess which one I didn't get an A in? I got a B plus though. Did you catch what Jesus said? But is not rich toward God. This man Jesus talked about denied the reality of death. He separated riches from God in any form. The truth is, if you're a follower of Christ, you have more riches than all the wealthiest people combined in this world. It means for a Christ follower, we live in light of our eternity, how we use our time, how we use our money, how we use our language, how we use our entertainment. We recognize that living in this world is only part of our existence, and that how we live here depends on what we believe about death and what we believe about eternity. I think life is much easier here when we live with the correct perspective about death and eternity. What's your outlook on death? My uncle, David Vaughn, who was one of the primary influencers who encouraged me to go into ministry, developed my philosophy about death as a Christian. He had a sermon that he had used. You remember revivals years ago? Some of you older folks remember revivals. He always opened up his revivals every time he'd have one with, "Are you afraid to die?" And he basically explained what the word death meant for the Christian, which is simply the separation of the soul from the body. Now, there might be complications with the physical body prior to death, but death itself is just when the soul leaves the body and enters into the Lord's presence. Oh, as my uncle aged, he developed prostate cancer that spread, and he was in hospice care the last few months he lived. Adam and I were down in Cincinnati one day, and we stopped to see him at the hospice care facility. And while we were there that particular day, he died in our presence. At his memorial service, I mentioned how I heard my uncle preach about death many times over, and then one day I actually saw him die. This life is so much easier if you know where you're going when you die. You have the right outlook. But Jesus gives us an objective to remember. You know, as we wrap up this series, Things Jesus Never Said, I want to flip this last part and notice something Jesus did say. Now, he did not say, I will make your life easy, but he did say in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, these words. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus didn't say, I'll make your life easy. Jesus did say, I'll give you rest. This is a beautiful passage. It is one that is often quoted, sometimes not easily understood. It's a little bit partially in response to how the legalistic Jews of the day, of Jesus' day, called Pharisees, had placed so many laws on the Jewish people that it was impossible to live according to their rules. And the idea of the rules was to initially provide rest for the Jews, especially on the Sabbath day. But they had become so cumbersome with these list of rules that they were a burden. You know, there are certain rules, there are certain laws in countries that can be burdensome. I ran across some old ones this week. In Fairbanks, Alaska, did you know it's illegal to serve alcohol to a moose? Just in case you were wondering, you wanted to do that. So you don't want to get a moose drunk, I guess. I don't know. There's a city in Arizona where it's illegal to drive a car in reverse. How do you get out of the mall parking lot? I'm just curious. A town in Oklahoma has an old law on the books where people who make ugly faces at dogs can be jailed or fined. I'm wondering, can a bulldog get thrown in the pound for making ugly faces at people? Jesus knew that many of the Jews had felt a heavy burden because they had all these restrictions placed on them. And Jesus came to not only fulfill the law, he came to change the heart's desire for following God. You don't follow God to be right with the law, you follow God out of love. I'm obedient to the Lord because I love him, not because I'm legally trying to follow rules. And when the disciples heard Jesus say, I will give you rest, there being good Hebrews, they would have immediately known that God had promised rest to Moses and the Israelites in the Old Testament. Now, we like that story of the Exodus where God frees the Hebrews from slavery and they begin this 40-year journey at the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. But when you carefully study that journey, Moses found himself in a position that was not enviable. The people constantly moaned and they complained about how bad things were for them. They quickly had forgotten how much they had suffered as slaves in Egypt. On several occasions, God threatened to wipe out the entire Israel nation. And so Moses would plead to God for mercy and patience because of these rebellious and these ungrateful Israelites. And there's this poignant moment where Moses pleads for God to protect the people and to keep guiding them. In Exodus 33, verse 13, he says, if you are pleased with me, Moses speaking to God, teach me your way so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. So Moses is boldly praying for the nation. He's praying for his own leadership ability over this group, but it's the response that God gives these disciples of Jesus would know. Verse 14, the Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. See, the promise of God's presence, that'd be music to the ears of Moses and these wandering people. God wasn't obligated to hang out with them. If he chose to abandon them, they would be sitting ducks for the nations around them. The promise of God's presence brought with it the guarantee of his provision and his protection. But it's the second part of God's promise in the Old Testament to Moses and the Israelites that would really perk up Jesus' listeners when he said, I will give you rest, because there's a cause and effect relationship here. God's presence yields God's rest. God's presence yields God's rest. The Hebrews knew that by rest, God not only meant the protection of their boundaries, but the emotional, the mental, the spiritual confidence they would have knowing God was with them. Because rest meant they could stop worrying about what might happen tomorrow. Rest was inseparable from God's presence. Now jump ahead 14 years later, when Jesus is standing before a group of weary spiritual seekers, and he invites them into a relationship with him, promising, I will give you rest. It's not an accidental statement here. The crowd would have murmured, did he just say what I think he said? And so while true, Jesus didn't say, I'll make your life easy. Jesus said, I'll give you rest. Even when difficulties in life seem to surround you, there's the promise of the Lord's presence. How do you get through the grief of the loss of a loved one, like the sudden death of a spouse? Some of you have been through that. You already know it's not by the grief leaving. It's by Jesus being with you. How do you manage the day-to-day struggles of your children, even as they grow into adults and they have a fender bender while at college? You know it's not by God removing accidents from our lives. It's by Jesus being with us. How do you get through sudden open heart surgery, intestinal surgery, skin cancer surgery? It's not by the Lord removing what are often natural occurrences of an aging human body, which is what my doctors keep telling me. I'm tired of hearing. It is His presence with us. How do you get through sudden unemployment? You weren't expecting it. The door got closed. It's God's presence. In the Old Testament, as the Israelites wandered for 40 years, and they had many challenges before them, God's presence was so obvious when He provided them a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide them. And so when the cloud moved, the Israelites would move. When the cloud stopped, the Israelites would stop. The objective wasn't that God would stop all of their struggles. The objective was they had to learn to depend on His presence. That has to be our objective, to seek God's presence so we can have rest. Like that rich man in Jesus' parable, if we don't have God's presence, we'll begin to seek things in this world to provide hope, and they're not going to do that. God can work through our lives even when it might be difficult for us because He can be with us. Darlene Diebler-Rose writes about her imprisonment in the book, Evidence Not Seen. She was taken captive in Indonesia by the Japanese during World War II. She was separated from her husband and put in a camp for women where she and other women were starved, were beaten, and were terrorized. At one point, she was taken from that camp and imprisoned in another camp with women who were marked for death. The interrogations were brutal. She and the other prisoners were beaten for the smallest infractions of the rules, such as failing to bow at the proper angle anytime a Japanese officer would come to your cell. One day, Darlene Diebler pulled herself up to the window in her cell to look out into a courtyard where women who had not been charged with such severe crimes were allowed to walk a few minutes each day. And she became fascinated with the actions of one woman who, every time the guard turned his back on her, inched her way a little closer to a vine-covered fence. When the guard turned and walked in her direction, she would stop. And Darlene realized that this woman must be meeting somebody at the fence. And so she became caught up in the drama, and she found herself looking out this little tiny window of her cell, rooting for this woman, willing that this other woman not get caught. And finally, she reached the fence, and when the guard's back was turned, a hand came through the fence with a large bunch of bananas. And the woman grabbed the bananas, stuck them in her sarong, and began to make her way back nonchalantly to rejoin the group. No one knew this woman had the bananas except Darlene from inside the prison cell. Darlene dropped to the cell floor. She began to shake and she began to cry and she began to crave bananas. Everything within her wanted a banana. She could see them. She could almost taste them. She said, Lord, I'm not asking you for a whole bunch of bananas like that woman has. I just want one banana, Lord, just one banana. And she began to think in her mind there was no way God could get her a banana in that prison. She dare not ask the guard. He wouldn't have done it. And if he did do it and he was discovered, it would mean his own death. But Darlene bowed and prayed, Lord, there's no one here who could get a banana to me. There is no way for you to do it. Please don't think I am not thankful for the 3 meals of rice porridge every day. It's just that, God, those bananas look so delicious. The next day, she heard the footsteps of the guard down the hallway. As emaciated as she was determined to get to her feet and bow at the proper angle. And filled with anxiety, the door opened. But to her surprise, it was not a guard from that camp standing there. It was the smiling face of the commander from the previous camp where she had been held. She clapped her hands and she hugged him immediately. And the commander, seeing how badly she was being treated, stepped back and his eyes began to fill with tears. He stepped away and went over to the group of interrogators to talk to them. He returned to Darlene's cell to tell her goodbye. And Darlene said, "Please tell the women at the other camp, I am still trusting the Lord. He is with me and He is with them. They will know what I mean, and I believe you do too." As the commander stepped away, Darlene realized she had not bowed, and she began to weep. She knew this meant that when he was out of her presence, the interrogators would now call for her, and she would be punished again. And moments later, she heard the footsteps coming towards her cell. She prayed, "Lord, I just can't do it again." And she struggled to her feet, fearing the worst. The guard opened the door, and he simply laid something at her feet. Bananas, a gift from the camp commander. She sat in stunned silence, and she counted them. Because it wasn't a bunch of banana, it was a whole tree limb of bananas. She counted 92 bananas. She pushed them into a corner, and she wept, "Lord, forgive me. I am so ashamed. I knew you were with me, and yet I could not trust you enough to get even one banana for me. And you gave me 100 bananas." Haven't we all had times when we have longed to see the evidence of God's presence? When we have felt we could hold on just a little bit longer if we knew He was there? I've learned something, I hope you have too. God's working does not depend on my totally understanding Him. Sometimes He will give us evidence of His presence, and sometimes He may not. We're to trust Him. There'll be times when we don't understand why life isn't easier, and we're not going to be able to totally comprehend in that moment of difficulties of how God may be able to work through it and work through us. But do we believe His promise, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest"? You who are heavy, you who are weary, you who are burdened, do you need to come and believe that He will give you rest? The Spirit and the bride say, "Come." And maybe that's what you need to do today. Maybe you need to come to Christ and make Him your Lord and Savior. Maybe you need to come to the church today and place your membership here. We'd love to have you be a part of this family. And so when we dismiss after our time of worship and communion together in just a few moments, I'll be up here near the baptistry area if you need to come forward and make a decision. Or maybe you need to go to the prayer room near the chapel. Maybe you're going through one of those difficult times of life, like some of the folks I've mentioned even in our own church this past week. Maybe you could use some encouragement through prayer and through other people. You can go there and be some folks that would love to encourage you and pray with you. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, may we have the faith and the perspective that does not deny the reality of death, and that we don't look as our riches as things just in this world, but may we never forget the riches we have in Jesus Christ through all that you provide for us and through us. And mostly, may we never forget that your presence is with us, even when we may not have the evidence, even when we may pray for things that don't come into being, don't come to pass. But God, it is your presence that we should be seeking every day. And so God, help us in maybe a week ahead for some sitting in this room. There's some worries, there's some major concerns ahead. And that you don't promise that you're going to take those away from us, but you promise you'll be with us through them, each and every one. And so God, may we worship your presence, and may we continue to do so just now. In Christ's name, amen.